On the morning of June 23rd, 1992, in a federal courtroom in Brooklyn, a judge asked a man who had barely spoken during his own 10-week trial if he had anything to say before he received his sentence. The man was 59 years old. He was standing beside the most famous criminal defendant in America, a man who at that moment was wearing a dark silk suit and a bright yellow tie, and smiling at the spectators who had risen to their feet when the two defendants entered the room. The famous man, when the same question was put to him, shook his head and said nothing. He had wisecracked his way through the entire trial, but at the moment when the court offered him center stage, he declined it. The quiet man did not. Frank Locascio stood and addressed the judge. He said, first, that he wanted to say emphatically that he was innocent. Then he paused. He said he was guilty, though, guilty of being a good friend of John Gotti. And if there were more men like John Gotti on this earth, he said, we would have a better country. The courtroom absorbed this. The judge imposed the sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for both men, a fine of $250,000 each. Outside the courthouse, Gotti's supporters overturned a federal marshal's car and fought with police in riot gear. 7 demonstrators were arrested. 8 officers were injured. A vendor in the plaza played the theme from The Godfather on a tape recorder and distributed free copies of a newly published book called The Gotti Tapes. The man in the silk suit would die in prison 10 years later, at 61, of throat cancer. The quiet man beside him would die in prison 29 years later, at 89, having served 31 years in federal custody without ever once cooperating with the government. He had been Gotti's Consigliere for approximately 3 years. He paid for those 3 years with the rest of his natural life. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below. It is genuinely one of the best parts of doing this. If you are new here and want more history like this delivered straight to you, subscribe now. Back to that courtroom in Brooklyn and the man who chose loyalty over everything else. The story of John Gotti has been told hundreds of times, in books and documentaries and courtroom transcripts and tabloid headlines that ran for a decade. The Teflon Don, the Dapper Don, the boss who waved to cameras and dined at the best restaurants and left $100 tips and beat the government 3 consecutive times before it finally put him away. That story has become one of the defining narratives of organized crime in America. But every story about a famous man obscures the stories of the men who stood beside him, who did the work the boss could not be seen doing, who carried the weight the boss distributed, and who absorbed the consequences the boss created. Some of those men cooperated with the government and walked free within years. Some of them ran, or hid, or cut deals that traded testimony for reduced sentences, and some of them did none of those things. Some of them stood up in court and praised the man who had put them there, and then went into the federal prison system and never came out. Frank Locascio was one of those men. He was born on September 24th, 1932 in New York City, to Italian immigrants from Balsina, a small town in the hills of western Sicily. He grew up in a world where the line between the neighborhood and the organization was not always a line anyone bothered to draw. By the 1950s, he was a made member of the Gambino crime family, sworn in through the blood oath and the burning saint card that marked a man as belonging to something larger and more permanent than himself. The Gambino family that Locascio entered as a young man in the 1950s was still decades away from the turmoil that would define its later history. The organization operated under a structure that had been formalized during the reorganization of New York's criminal underworld in the early 1930s, when the chaotic gang wars of Prohibition gave way to the more orderly confederation that became known as the Commission. 5 families, each with its own territory, its own leadership, and its own revenue streams, agreed to resolve disputes through negotiation rather than violence, to respect each other's claims, and to submit questions of interfamily significance to a ruling body composed of the bosses. The system was not democratic. It was not transparent, but it functioned, for decades, with a stability that surprised the law enforcement agencies that studied it. Within this system, a man like Locascio could build a career that lasted decades without ever attracting significant attention. The bookmaking and loan sharking operations he ran in the Bronx were the bread and butter enterprises of the organization, generating steady income without the volatility of drug trafficking or the exposure of construction rackets. A bookmaker took bets. A loan shark extended credit at rates that the legitimate banking system would not offer and enforced repayment through methods the legitimate system could not employ. These were operations that required a certain kind of temperament, patience, reliability, discretion, and the willingness to maintain relationships over years and decades, rather than pursuing quick profits. Locascio possessed these qualities. He was not flashy. He was not violent in any way that attracted investigation. He was, by all available accounts, exactly the kind of man who made an organization like the Gambino family function at the level where most of its actual work was done. He worked as a bookmaker and a loan shark, the foundational earning activities that kept the organization solvent at the street level, and he proved himself reliable enough to be promoted to capo regime, the captain of a crew operating out of the Bronx. He ran his crew quietly. He did not seek attention. He did not attract law enforcement scrutiny in any proportion to the decades he spent operating. He was 53 years old when everything changed, and the event that changed it was not something he initiated, planned, or approved. It was a murder that happened in Midtown Manhattan on a December evening that rearranged the entire power structure of the organization he had served for 30 years. On the evening of December 16th, 1985, two men were shot dead outside a steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan, and the quiet captain from the Bronx was pulled into the orbit of the most dangerous and most visible criminal in America. The Gambino crime family that Locascio had joined as a young man in the 1950s was, by the time he rose to the rank of captain, the most powerful and most profitable criminal organization in New York City and arguably in the country. Its namesake, Carlo Gambino, had run the family from the late 1950s until his death from a heart attack on October 15th, 1976. Gambino had governed with a philosophy that prized discretion above all other organizational virtues. He avoided publicity, cultivated political connections, and built an empire that extended into the garment district, the waterfront, the construction industry, and the labor unions without ever appearing on the front page of a newspaper if he could avoid it. The family under his leadership was estimated to have between 500 and 1,000 members and associates, generating revenue across dozens of legitimate and illegitimate enterprises. When Gambino died, he passed the position not to his underboss, Agnello Neal Della Croce, but to his brother-in-law Paul Castellano. The decision was controversial from the moment it was announced. Castellano was a businessman first, a man who preferred the insulation of corporate structures and real estate deals and meat distribution companies to the street-level work that most of the family's soldiers understood and valued. He operated from a hilltop mansion on Staten Island that the newspapers called the White House, and his management style created a rift between two wings of the organization that would widen over the next decade until it produced the event that made Locaccio's story possible. On one side was Castellano and the men who operated in his image, the businessmen and the earners who worked through construction companies and union contracts and kept the violence at a bureaucratic distance. On the other was Della Croce and the street crews he commanded, the men who ran gambling operations and loan sharking and hijacking out of social clubs in Queens and Brooklyn, men for whom the organization's identity was rooted in something older and more visceral than corporate structure. John Gotti was one of those men. He ran the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club crew in Ozone Park, Queens, and his loyalty to Della Croce was absolute. When Della Croce died of cancer on December 2nd, 1985, the last restraint holding the two factions together died with him. The tension between Castellano and the street crews was not merely philosophical, it had practical consequences that affected every member of the organization. Castellano had imposed a strict prohibition on drug dealing within the family, a rule that was publicly articulated as a matter of principle, but privately understood as a matter of exposure. Drug operations attracted the most intense federal scrutiny. They produced the longest sentences. They generated the greatest incentive for soldiers and associates to cooperate with the government. Castellano's rule was not about morality, it was about risk management. but the rule was enforced unevenly, and the men who violated it most flagrantly were among those closest to Gotti. Angelo Ruggiero, one of Gotti's lifelong friends, had been recorded extensively by the FBI discussing heroin trafficking, and the tapes from those recordings threatened to bring down not just Ruggiero, but anyone connected to him. Gene Gotti, John's brother, was also implicated. Della Croce had shielded them from Castellano's wrath for years, but with Della Croce gone, Castellano was positioning himself to act. Gotti understood that if Castellano obtained the Ruggiero tapes, the information they contained would give the boss justification to eliminate Gotti's entire crew. The assassination was not merely about ambition. For Gotti, it was a preemptive act of survival. Castellano did not attend Della Croce's wake. He cited his legal troubles and a desire to lay low. To the men who had loved Della Croce, the absence was an unforgivable insult. Then Castellano made a second decision that sealed his fate. He named his personal bodyguard, Thomas Bellotti, as the new underboss, passing over Gotti and every other captain who had served under Della Croce. 14 days after Della Croce was buried, Paul Castellano stepped out of a car on East 46th Street and walked into the last seconds of his life. Sparks Steakhouse sits at 210 East 46th Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenues in Midtown Manhattan, a neighborhood of office workers and Christmas shoppers that on the evening of December 16, 1985, was the site of the most brazen mob assassination in modern American history. Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti had been invited to a dinner meeting at the restaurant, a well-known mob dining venue, during what was one of the busiest weeks of the year and one of the busiest parts of the city. The brazenness of the location was deliberate. John Gotti had positioned two separate hit teams outside the restaurant. The primary team consisted of 4 shooters dressed in identical white trench coats and Russian fur hats, the matching outfits serving both to identify each other in the crowd and to make individual identification by witnesses more difficult. As Castellano exited the passenger side of his Lincoln sedan, the 4 men stepped forward and opened fire. Castellano was hit approximately 6 times and collapsed on the sidewalk beside the car. Bellotti, sitting in the driver's seat, attempted to exit and was shot immediately, his body falling into the street where rivulets of blood ran from beneath him across the pavement. Both men were dead within seconds. John Gotti and Salvatore Gravano watched the executions from a car parked nearby, on the same block, close enough to confirm the kills. The hit had been orchestrated without commission approval, a violation of one of the foundational rules governing the relationships between the 5 New York families, and its success depended entirely on the speed with which Gotti could consolidate power before anyone could organize a response. The decision to kill Castellano was not made by a single ambitious captain acting alone. It was the product of a coalition assembled carefully over months, consisting of men who had concluded, each for his own reasons, that the current leadership of the family had become untenable. Frank DeCicco, one of Castellano's own captains, had recognized the growing resentment across the family and understood that the organization was at risk of fragmenting. DeCicco's support was essential because he bridged the gap between Gotti's faction and the broader body of captains whose consent, or at least acquiescence, was necessary for the transition to hold. Gravano, who had built his own construction and drywall empire within the family, concluded that backing the hit was the most pragmatic way to protect his crew and secure his own future. The result was not a conspiratorial group bound by a single ideology, but a transient coalition of factions, each convinced it had more to lose by waiting than by acting. The killing itself was designed to send a message about the new order. Castellano was not ambushed in a hallway or shot in the back seat of a car in some quiet neighborhood. He was executed on one of the busiest commercial streets in the most prominent city in the country, during the Christmas shopping season, at the peak of the evening rush, in front of a restaurant that catered to the kind of clientele who read the front pages of the New York tabloids. The spectacle was intentional. Gotti wanted the world to see what had happened and to draw the obvious conclusion about who was now in charge. The consolidation was swift. Within days, Gotti was proclaimed the new boss of the Gambino family. The men who had participated in or supported the plot were rewarded. DeCicco became underboss. Gravano rose alongside Gotti. DeCicco himself would not survive long enough to enjoy the position. On April 13th, 1986, less than 4 months after the Castellano hit, a remote-controlled bomb detonated under DeCicco's car in the Diker Heights neighborhood of Brooklyn, killing him instantly. The bomb had been planted by members of the Lucchese family, acting on behalf of Genevieve's boss, Vincent Gigante, who was furious that the Castellano assassination had been carried out without commission approval. The bombing was intended for Gotti, who had been expected to be in the car with DeCicco that day but had changed his plans at the last minute. The violence that Gotti's seizure of power had unleashed was already claiming the lives of the men who had helped make it possible, and the men who had been loyal to Castellano found that their positions and their safety depended on how quickly and how convincingly they could demonstrate loyalty to the new regime. The reorganization created openings at every level of the hierarchy. Captains who had been marginalized under Castellano found themselves promoted. Associates who had demonstrated their usefulness during the transition were rewarded with responsibility, and men who had operated quietly for decades, doing their work without attracting attention, discovered that the new boss valued loyalty above all other qualities, and the world obliged the new boss's appetite for fame. Within weeks, Gotti was being photographed at restaurants, interviewed outside courthouses, and written about in every newspaper in New York. He waved to cameras. He dressed in suits that cost thousands of dollars. He hosted an annual 4th of July fireworks display in his neighborhood in Howard Beach, Queens, that drew thousands of spectators and was covered by local television as though it were a civic event. He became, in the space of a few months, the most public criminal figure in America, a man who treated his own notoriety as proof of his invincibility rather than as evidence of his vulnerability. The FBI, which had been photographing his captains walking into the Ravenite for years, now had a subject who was cooperating with their surveillance operation by performing for the cameras himself. The unit responsible for building the case against Gotti was the Gambino squad of the FBI's New York field office, led by Supervisor Bruce Mao. Mao was a methodical investigator who understood that the flamboyance of the target was both an advantage and a distraction. The advantage was that Gotti made himself easy to find. He appeared at the Ravenite on a predictable schedule. He dined at known restaurants. He traveled in identifiable vehicles with identifiable associates. The disadvantage was that his public persona had generated a mystique that extended into the courtroom, where 3 successive juries had acquitted him. Mao's approach was to build a case so comprehensive that no jury, however sympathetic, could ignore the evidence. The surveillance operation that Mao's squad constructed around the Ravenite was layered. The exterior photography documented who came and went. The interior bug, planted in 1988, captured conversations from the main room of the club, though the quality was inconsistent. The hallway bug captured brief exchanges as Gotti moved between the club and the stairwell, and then, with the Sorelli apartment bug planted in November of 1989, the squad had penetrated the innermost sanctum, the room where Gotti believed he was speaking freely, surrounded only by the men he trusted. The irony was that Gotti had chosen the Sorelli apartment specifically to avoid the bugs he suspected existed in the club below. He would begin conversations while climbing the stairs, a habit that FBI agents in the hallway captured, and that tipped them off to the significance of the upstairs apartment. He was, in effect, leading the investigation to his own most sensitive discussions. Every precaution he took was one step behind the surveillance that was already in place. For the men who surrounded Gotti, the boss's public persona created a specific and dangerous set of conditions. The attention that Gotti attracted was not directed at him alone. It extended to everyone in his orbit, every captain who walked through the door of the Ravenite, every associate who was photographed shaking his hand outside a Manhattan restaurant, every lieutenant who appeared in the background of a tabloid photograph. The visibility that Gotti cultivated as a shield was, for the men around him, an exposure that they had not chosen and could not control. Locascio, A man who had spent 3 decades avoiding exactly this kind of attention was now one of the most prominent figures in the most scrutinized criminal organization in the country, not because he sought the spotlight, but because the boss had summoned him to stand in it. Among those men, Locascio had operated at a level of the organization where the work was steady and the visibility was low. He ran gambling and loan sharking operations, he managed his crew's earnings, and he reported up through the hierarchy without creating problems. Under the old boss, this kind of quiet competence was valued but not rewarded with proximity to the top. Under the new boss, everything was different. Gotti wanted men around him who were dependable, who would come when called, who would sit in the rooms where decisions were made and carry those decisions out without complaint. Locascio was one of those men, and within 2 years of the Castellano assassination, he was inside the innermost circle of the most powerful criminal organization in the city. In 1987, Joseph Piney Armoni, the family's official underboss, was convicted on racketeering charges and sentenced to a prison term that would keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. Armoni died in the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri in 1992. The position he vacated needed to be filled. Gotti named Locascio as acting underboss, placing the quiet man from the Bronx in the number 2 seat of an organization that was generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually across construction rackets, waterfront operations, labor unions, gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. The position of Consigliere in the organizational structure of a New York crime family was, in theory, one of the most important in the hierarchy. The Consigliere served as an advisor to the boss, a mediator in disputes between crews, and a check on the exercise of power that was supposed to prevent the kind of reckless decision-making that could endanger the entire organization. In practice, under Gotti, the position was something different. Gotti did not seek advice. He gave orders. The men who held formal positions in his administration, whether underboss or consigliere, served at his pleasure and performed the functions he assigned to them. Their titles gave them standing within the organization but no independent authority. The boss decided. Everyone else carried out the decision or sat in the room while it was made, but the appointment was not permanent. Before long, an incident occurred that would reshape the administration and, in ways that would not become clear for years, reshape the trajectory of Locascio's entire remaining life. A Gambino soldier named Louis De Bono had been avoiding Gotti's summons to meetings. De Bono held a lucrative contract to apply fireproofing foam to the steel crossbeams beneath each floor of the World Trade Center's Twin Towers, work that was generating substantial income for himself and for the organization. His failure to appear when the boss called was, in Gotti's view, an intolerable insult. Locascio attempted to intervene. He went to Gotti and proposed a resolution. De Bono would pay the boss $50,000 to compensate for his absences, and the matter would be settled without violence. Gotti was not interested in a settlement. He interpreted Locaccio's attempt at peacemaking as a challenge to his authority, and the response was immediate. Locascio was demoted from acting underboss to acting consigliere. Salvatore Gravano was promoted to fill the underboss position. The demotion was Gotti's way of establishing that the boss made the decisions about who lived and who died, and the consigliere did not broker peace deals that the boss had not requested. Locascio absorbed the demotion without protest. He continued to appear at the Ravenite Social Club, continued to sit in the rooms where the business was conducted, continued to serve the boss, who had just reduced his standing for the crime of trying to save a man's life. Locaccio's tenure as acting consigliere reflected the reality of serving under Gotti. He was present at meetings where significant decisions were discussed. He was privy to the operational details of the family's enterprises, including the gambling operations, the loan sharking networks, the construction rackets, and the labor union arrangements that generated the bulk of the organization's revenue. The Gambino family, under Gotti, was estimated to earn between $100 million and $500 million annually across its various enterprises. Locascio sat in rooms where the distribution of that wealth was discussed, where disputes about who owed what to whom were adjudicated, and where the fates of men who had fallen out of favor were determined, What he did not do, by all available accounts, was talk. The tape recordings that would later serve as the prosecution's primary evidence captured a man who listened, who acknowledged what was said to him, who did not volunteer opinions or challenge decisions. Whether this silence reflected genuine deference or a calculated understanding that speaking in rooms that might be bugged was dangerous is a question the historical record does not answer definitively. What it does answer is that the silence was consistent. Across hundreds of hours of recorded conversation, Frank Locascio was, by volume of speech, barely present. He was convicted not for what he said, but for what he did not say. 5 nights a week for years, the two most senior members of the Gambino administration walked into a building that was already the most surveilled mob location in New York City because the boss had told them to come, and neither man was in a position to explain why that was a problem. 247 Mulberry Street was a 5-story brick building in what remained of Little Italy, a neighborhood that had been contracting for decades but that still held in its last few blocks the density and insularity that had made it useful to the men who operated from its storefronts and social clubs. The building housed the Ravenite Social Club on its ground floor, a nondescript space with little more than a card table and an espresso machine, and the portraits of Gotti and his late mentor Della Croce hanging on the back wall. Gotti had moved his headquarters there from Queens after becoming boss, and his insistence that his captains present themselves at the club every Wednesday evening turned the narrow block of Mulberry Street between Prince and Spring into a weekly parade of organized crime figures that the FBI documented with a camera and a telephoto lens from across the street. Beginning in February of 1988, agents captured photographs of every man who entered and exited the club, building an organizational chart of the Gambino family from the front door of its own headquarters. They bugged the club's interior that same year, but the recordings yielded little of evidentiary value. Gotti was careful about what he said inside the club, and the background noise from the television and the espresso machine and the card games made the recordings difficult to transcribe. Then an informant delivered a tip that changed everything. The informant reported that Gotti sometimes left the Ravenite through a back door and entered the adjacent first-floor hallway of the building, where he spoke with captains away from the club's interior. The same informant reported that Gotti would sometimes leave the hallway and go upstairs to an apartment in the building. Agents investigated and identified the apartment as belonging to Nettie Sorelli, a 74-year-old widow whose husband, Michael Sorelli, had been a Gambino soldier. The apartment had previously been used by Della Croce himself for his own private meetings. When Gotti needed to discuss the most sensitive matters, he sent Sorelli shopping on his dime and used her apartment as a conference room. Over Thanksgiving weekend of 1989, Nettie Sorelli left for a vacation in Florida. The FBI surveillance team, armed with the schematic of the building's interior, entered the apartment and planted a listening device. The operation was, by any standard of what it produced, one of the most consequential electronic surveillance operations in the history of organized crime prosecution. The recordings captured John Gotti discussing murders, criminal operations, and the inner workings of the Gambino family, with the specificity that federal prosecutors had been trying to obtain for years. He talked about the Castellano assassination. He discussed the killing of an associate named Robert DiBernardo, saying he was in jail when the order was carried out, but that he had allowed it to be done. He talked about De Bono and why De Bono was going to die. He disparaged members of his own organization, questioning their loyalty, criticizing their judgment, calling them greedy or weak or unreliable. The voice on the tapes was arrogant, voluble, and utterly unguarded. Locascio was present during many of these conversations. His voice appears on the recordings, but barely. He listened. He acknowledged what was said to him with minimal responses. On the tape that would matter most at trial, Gotti told Locascio directly that De Bono was going to be killed, explaining the reasons in the language of a man who expected no objection and received none. Locascio said nothing. The silence on the recording was, in legal terms, the sound of a man assenting to murder. The contrast between Locascio and the boss he served could not have been more complete. Gotti filled rooms with his voice. He dominated every conversation. He criticized associates by name on recordings, boasted about his authority, and discussed sensitive criminal matters with a candor that suggested he either did not believe the rooms were bugged or did not care. His voice on the tapes was the voice of a man who had confused the absence of consequences with the absence of risk. 3 acquittals had taught him that he was untouchable. The tapes would eventually teach the world that he was not. Louis de Bono was a Gambino soldier who had found a way to make money that required almost no violence and very little organizational overhead, which should have been exactly what any rational boss would have wanted from a member of his organization. He was 63 years old and weighed 310 pounds. His fireproofing contract at the World Trade Center was generating substantial legitimate income. His crime, in the eyes of the boss, was not financial. It was personal. He had failed to come in when summoned, repeatedly, and in a system where a man's physical presence at the designated location at the designated time was the fundamental unit of respect, his absence was interpreted as something more serious than scheduling difficulty. On October 4th, 1990, DeBarno was shot 3 times in the head in an underground parking garage beneath the North Tower of the World Trade Center. His body was found by a parking attendant lying across the front seat of his 1987 Cadillac around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He had been shot outside the car and then pulled onto the front seat and left there. The killing produced no newspaper coverage for days, which concerned Gravano enough that he sent for one of Gotti's associates to confirm the job had been done. The actual shooter was later identified as Charles Carneglia, a Gambino soldier and member of Gotti's inner circle of hit men, who was convicted in 2009 and sentenced to life in prison. At trial, the government's case on this murder rested not on evidence that Locascio had ordered or participated in the killing, but on the recording from the Corelli apartment in which Gotti announced his intention to have DeBono killed, and Locascio sat in the room and said nothing. Judge I. Leo Glasser would later write that Locaccio's utter silence upon that stark pronouncement bespeaks a wordless assent, and that the wordless assent was to a death sentence on DeBono, not because he committed a crime, but worse, only because he did not come in when called by John Gotti. A man who tried to save DeBono's life by brokering a $50,000 peace deal was convicted of his murder because he was in the room when the decision was announced and did not object a second time. Less than 10 weeks after DeBono's body was found in that parking garage, the men who had ordered and permitted his death were drinking espresso at the Ravenite when the doors opened and the men who came through them were not there for coffee. The evening of December 11th, 1990, began like any other evening at 247 Mulberry Street. Locascio arrived around 5 o'clock, accompanied by a bodyguard. Gravano arrived an hour later with Captain Louis Valario. Gotti arrived after that in his black Mercedes, driven by his associate Jackie D'Amico. They settled into the back room of the Ravenite, the portraits on the wall behind them, the espresso on the table. Then the FBI came through the door. Agent George Gabriel led the entry team straight to the back room. Gotti and Gravano were getting ready to enjoy their coffee. The mobsters were stunned by the arrival, but Gotti remained calm. He said he was not going anywhere until he finished his espresso. When he had, the 3 men were taken into federal custody. Thomas Gambino, the grandson of Carlo Gambino and a reputed captain, was arrested separately in the Garment District on lesser charges. The indictment charged Gotti, Locascio, and Gravano with racketeering, multiple murders, conspiracy, gambling, loan sharking, obstruction of justice, and bribery. For any other defendant, the strength of the evidence might have seemed overwhelming. For Gotti, it was simply the latest round in a contest he had been winning for 4 years. Between 1986 and 1990, Gotti had been tried 3 times on serious criminal charges and acquitted every time. The details of those acquittals revealed a pattern that went beyond ordinary legal defense. In the 1986 racketeering trial, prosecutors Diane Giacalone and John Gleason presented a case built on wiretap evidence and cooperating witness testimony, but a juror named George Pape had been compromised. Pape had concealed his connections to organized crime figures during jury selection and once seated, held out for acquittal. The remaining jurors, sensing that the holdout was motivated by something other than reasonable doubt and frightened by the implications, ultimately voted to acquit on all charges. 5 years later, Pape was convicted of obstruction of justice and sentenced to 3 years in prison for fixing the verdict. The second acquittal, in 1987, on assault charges, was followed by a third in 1990, when Gotti beat a case connected to the shooting of a carpenters union official named John O'Connor. In each case, the acquittal reinforced Gotti's public image as a man the government could not touch, and the acquittals had earned him the nickname the Teflon Don. But the government that indicted him in December of 1990 had learned from every failure. The FBI's Organized Crime Division in New York had not been directly involved in any of the three cases that produced acquittals. The investigation that led to the December 1990 arrest was the FBI's case, built on the FBI's surveillance, driven by the FBI's squad under Supervisor Bruce Mao and prosecuted by John Gleason, the same assistant United States attorney who had been part of the failed 1986 prosecution and who now had something he had not possessed the first time, the boss's own voice, recorded in his own words, discussing his own crimes. The prosecutors moved to disqualify Gotti's preferred attorney, Bruce Cutler, from the case. Cutler had won all three previous acquittals and had become as much a public figure as his client, throwing indictments into trash cans in front of juries, wearing exaggerated collars that mimicked Gotti's style, and building a combative courtroom, persona that prosecutors believed was inseparable from the criminal organization itself. Judge I. Leo Glasser agreed with the government's argument that recordings showed Cutler and two other attorneys had acted as house counsel for the Gambino crime organization, making them potential witnesses in the case. All three lawyers were disqualified. Gotti was forced to retain a new attorney, Albert Krieger. Then the judge granted the prosecution's request for an anonymous and sequestered jury, the first in a Brooklyn federal case. The jurors would be identified only by number, sequestered at an undisclosed hotel, and shielded from any possibility of contact with the defendants or their associates. The history of jury tampering that had produced Gotti's previous acquittals was, for the first time, architecturally prevented, and then the foundation collapsed entirely. Salvatore Gravano had been sitting in the Metropolitan Correctional Center with Gotti and Locascio since the arrest, awaiting a trial that all three men expected to fight together. But Gravano was hearing things that changed his calculations. Federal prosecutors had played him the recordings from the Sorelli apartment, and what he heard on those tapes was his boss disparaging him to other associates, questioning his loyalty, calling him greedy, and, most destructively, appearing to set Gravano up to take the fall for the murders that all of them were charged with. Gotti had told Gravano to his face that the tapes made Gravano sound like a monster, and that the legal strategy would involve the lawyers presenting Gravano as the principal figure behind the violence, while shielding Gotti from the worst of the evidence. Gravano understood what this meant. He was being positioned as the sacrificial offering. The relationship between the three defendants fractured behind the walls of the MCC in ways that the public would not learn about for years. In an incident described in Gravano's memoir Underboss, Locascio gave Gravano a stolen orange in the jail before offering one to Gotti. The gesture was trivial. Gotti's response was not. He became furious and loudly belittled Locascio in front of other inmates, humiliating the older man over a piece of fruit. Later, according to Gravano, a tearful Locascio vowed to murder Gotti. Gravano claims the two men made a pact. If they were somehow acquitted, they would lure Gotti to a victory party, and Locascio insisted on being the shooter. The decision Gravano made was not, by the available accounts, an easy one. He had spent his entire adult life within the organization. He had killed 19 people in its service. He had built an identity around the principles it claimed to uphold. Breaking the oath of omerta, the code of silence that governed every made member's relationship to the outside world, was the most fundamental betrayal the organization recognized. A man who broke that oath was, in the language of the world he was leaving, a rat, and the word carried a weight that no amount of federal protection could entirely neutralize. Gravano understood that he was trading one prison for another. He would be free of the federal sentence, or most of it, but he would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, living under an assumed name, separated from everyone and everything that had defined him. He made the choice anyway. The tapes had shown him that the man he had been willing to die for was planning to let him take the fall. Whether the pact was real or a dramatic embellishment in a memoir designed to sell copies is impossible to verify. What is verifiable is that on November 13th, 1991, Gravano entered into a formal cooperation agreement with the federal government. His wife, Debbie, had initially reached out to prosecutors on his behalf, a violation of the fundamental mob principle that kept the man's family separated from his family. Gravano agreed to plead guilty and to testify against Gotti and Locascio. He was the highest-ranking member of a New York crime family to ever turn informer. The decision destroyed the defense, but it also created a specific and devastating problem for Locascio that had nothing to do with the evidence against him. According to an affidavit filed years later in Locaccio's habeas corpus proceedings, Gotti had threatened Locaccio's trial attorney, Anthony Cardinale, with death if Cardinale attempted to individualize the interest of Locascio at Gotti's expense. The threat meant that Cardinale was forbidden from cross-examining Gravano about Locaccio's lack of involvement in the Di Bono murder, forbidden from pursuing a defense strategy that distinguished Locaccio's culpability from Gotti's, and required to subordinate his client's interests to those of the man who had ordered his client's demotion and was now ordering his client's lawyer to sacrifice him. Locaccio's defense was, according to this account, conducted not in his interest but in Gotti's. The trial that began in January of 1992 was no longer a contest between the government and the Gambino family. It was a prosecution built on the testimony of the boss's own underboss and the recordings of the boss's own voice, and the man sitting beside the boss at the defense table was there because he had not been given the option of sitting anywhere else. Jury selection began in January from a pool of more than 500 prospective jurors. The trial commenced on February 12th, 1992. Judge R. Leo Glasser presided. The prosecution was led by John Gleason and Andrew Maloney. Albert Krieger represented Gotti. Anthony Cardinale represented Locascio. The government's case rested on two pillars: the tape recordings from the Sorelli apartment and the testimony of Salvatore Gravano. Prosecutors played hours of recordings in which Gotti's voice filled the courtroom, discussing murders and criminal operations with a directness that left nothing to interpretation. Background music from the apartment, O Sole Mio and Sunrise, Sunset, played beneath his recorded words. Speakers were provided for the spectators. Gotti, wearing a well-tailored brown suit and floral print tie, declined the headphones offered by the court and sat without expression as his own voice boomed through the room. The evidence the government presented over the course of the 6-week trial was comprehensive in a way that Gotti's previous prosecutors had never achieved. The Sorelli apartment recordings were the centerpiece, but they were supported by years of surveillance documentation, financial records, organizational charts built from photographs taken outside the Ravenite, and the testimony of cooperating witnesses who could explain the context and significance of what the tapes contained. Agent George Gabriel, who had been assigned to the Gambino squad since 1985, was qualified as an expert witness and testified about the structure, methods, and terminology of the organization. Gravano took the witness stand and testified for 9 days. He admitted to participating in 19 murders over the course of his career in the Gambino family. He described the organizational structure, the chain of command, the earning operations, the decision-making process that determined who lived and who died. He recounted crimes that Gotti had ordered, sanctioned, or directly committed. He testified about the Castellano assassination, describing the planning, the positioning of the hit teams, and the moment of execution with the detachment of a man recounting operational details rather than acts of violence. He testified about the Di Bono killing, confirming that Gotti had ordered it and that the reason was nothing more than De Bono's failure to report when summoned. For Locascio, the trial presented a particular cruelty. He sat at the defense table beside a man whose voice was the primary evidence against both of them, a man who had threatened his lawyer, a man who had demoted him for trying to save the life of the person whose murder he was now charged with facilitating. Cardinale devoted his summation largely to an attack on Gravano's credibility, which he believed was the key to the government's case, with only passing references to the lack of direct evidence against Locascio. He did not cross-examine Gravano about Locaccio's attempt to save De Bono. He did not argue that Locaccio's silence on the tapes reflected something other than agreement. He did not individualize his client's defense at Gotti's expense. The jury was not informed of any of this. They saw two defendants sitting together at the same table, facing the same charges, and heard testimony describing both as members of the same criminal administration. In his summation, Krieger accused the government of victimizing his client with a case manufactured from Gravano's lies. Prosecutor Gleason replied, "These defendants ranted and raved about Salvatore Gravano because he is their nightmare." The sole defense witness was a tax lawyer who had advised Gotti to exercise a legitimate privilege of silence by not filing tax returns while under indictment. Judge Glasser ruled that the other 5 proposed defense witnesses would be inappropriate for various legal reasons. On April 2nd, 1992, after approximately 13 hours of deliberation over less than 2 days, the forewoman read the verdict. She repeated the word as the deputy read through the 13-count indictment. For the racketeering counts, she said guilty, guilty, guilty. Gotti put a finger to his lips to silence the supporters and associates sitting in the courtroom's spectator benches. Locascio was convicted on all charges except one count related to an illegal gambling operation in Queens. The conviction included the murder of Louis De Bono and a conspiracy to murder. 5 separate murders were attributed to Gotti. The Teflon was gone. Every charge had stuck. On the morning of June 23, 1992, Gotti's friends and associates filled the spectator rows of the courtroom and rose when the 2 defendants entered. Gotti was wearing a charcoal suit and a bright yellow tie. He patted Locascio on the back. According to Krieger, Gotti told his co-defendant in that moment that they had only just begun to fight. Judge Glasser asked each defendant if he wished to speak. Gotti shook his head. He smiled. He said nothing. Then Locascio stood. The man whose voice had barely appeared on hundreds of hours of recordings, the man whose silence on a tape had been interpreted as consent to murder, chose this moment to speak. He said he was innocent. He said he was guilty of being a good friend of John Gotti. He said that, if there were more men like John Gotti, this would be a better country. The sentencing hearing itself was, in the peculiar theater of the federal criminal justice system, a performance that both men had been rehearsing in different ways for months. Gotti's silence was calculated, a final exercise of the control that had defined his public persona throughout the trial. He would not give the judge the satisfaction of a statement. He would not acknowledge the verdict's authority over him. He would stand and smile and say nothing, and the smile would be interpreted by his supporters as defiance and by everyone else as denial. Locaccio's statement was something different. It was not defiance, and it was not denial. It was an act of loyalty so public and so complete that it obliterated whatever individual identity he might have claimed. He did not say he had been wronged by the system. He did not say the evidence was fabricated. He did not say Gravano was a liar. He said he was guilty of being a good friend. The statement collapsed the distinction between the man and his allegiance. Whatever Frank Locascio had been before that moment, whoever he was, apart from the organization he served, was subordinated to the declaration of friendship with the man who sat beside him. It was, depending on how one heard it, either the most admirable or the most self-destructive thing anyone said in that courtroom. Judge Glasser imposed the sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a fine of $250,000 for each defendant. Outside the courthouse, demonstrators clashed with police in riot gear and federal marshals. They overturned a marshal's car. 7 protesters were arrested on felony riot charges. 8 officers were injured. On the plaza outside the building, a vendor played the Godfather theme and gave away paperback copies of the Gotti tapes. Inside the building, the 2 men were processed and entered the federal prison system. Gotti was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, one of the most secure federal facilities in the country, where he would be held in virtual solitary confinement. In October of 1993, the Second Circuit affirmed both convictions, rejecting arguments about the wiretap evidence and trial errors. Gotti died of throat cancer at the age of 61 on June 10, 2002, in the medical center at Marion. He was cremated. The man whose fame had shaped the final decade of organized crime's public image was gone, and the quiet man who had sat beside him in that Brooklyn courtroom was still alive, still in prison, still serving a sentence that had no end date at the age of 69. The man whose testimony had put both Gotti and Locascio in prison for life received as his reward a sentence of 5 years. Gravano had admitted to participating in 19 murders. He had been the underboss of the most powerful criminal organization in New York. For all of this, he served 5 years in federal custody before entering the Witness Protection Program. The program relocated him to Arizona, where he settled under an assumed name. The attempt at a new life failed spectacularly. By the late 1990s, Gravano had organized and was running the largest ecstasy distribution ring in the state, a drug operation that generated millions of dollars and involved dozens of associates, many of them teenagers. He was arrested in 2000, convicted on state drug charges, and sentenced to 20 years. A separate federal conviction added additional time. He was released from custody in 2017, 25 years after the trial that had made him the most famous mob turncoat in American history. The years accumulated in the way that years do inside a federal medical facility, each one measured not by events but by their absence, each one adding to the total that the sentence had promised would never produce a release date. Locascio entered federal custody on December 11th, 1990, and from that date forward, his life was defined by 2 parallel tracks: the unchanging reality of incarceration and the sustained, methodical effort to overturn the conviction that had put him there. The Federal Medical Center at Devens occupies the grounds of a decommissioned Army base in north-central Massachusetts, approximately 40 miles northwest of Boston. Locascio arrived there on March 22, 2001, at the age of 68, and the facility became the only world he would know for the remaining 20 years of his life. Inside Devens, Locascio was, by all available accounts, a quiet and well-regarded inmate. His daughter Lisa said that the staff at the facility treated him with respect and that he was a favorite among them. Fellow mobsters who were incarcerated at the same facility sought him out, not because of anything he had done during his years as Consigliere, but because of what he had not done in the years since. He had not cooperated. He had not broken the code. In a world where the oath of omerta had been shattered by one cooperating witness after another, Locaccio's refusal to cooperate became, paradoxically, the most notable thing about him. His silence in the courtroom had convicted him. His silence in prison made him a figure of respect. And yet Locascio never broke. He never testified. He never cooperated. He never used the one piece of leverage he possessed, his knowledge of the organization's secrets, to negotiate his freedom. The years passed. The appeals failed. The world outside changed in ways he could observe only through the narrow aperture of a federal medical facility. The Berlin Wall fell. The internet emerged. The towers where De Bono had worked his fireproofing contract were destroyed. Wars began and ended. Presidents came and went. And the quiet man from the Bronx remained where the sentence had placed him, growing old in increments so gradual that each day was indistinguishable from the one before it, the accumulated weight of 31 years pressing down on a life that the legal system had determined would end inside those walls. In October of 2000, Locascio filed his first motion to vacate his sentence, alleging ineffective assistance of counsel. The claim rested on the allegation that his trial attorney, Cardinale, had received a death threat from Gotti, warning him not to pursue a defense strategy that distinguished Locaccio's interests from Gotti's. According to an affidavit filed in support of the motion, Cardinale had been prevented from cross-examining Gravano about Locaccio's lack of involvement in the Di Bono murder and had been forced to subordinate his client's defense to the demands of the co-defendant who was threatening his life. The district court denied the motion. Locascio appealed. In 2005, the Second Circuit remanded the case for an evidentiary hearing. The hearing was held. Cardinale was the sole witness. He denied or minimized the allegations in his testimony. The district court denied the motion again. In 2007, the Second Circuit affirmed. Meanwhile, behind the walls of the federal system, a threat of a different kind was materializing. According to court papers and law enforcement sources, Gotti, serving his life sentence at Marion, had become infuriated after the publication of Gravano's memoir, Underboss, in 1997. The book contained the passage about the stolen orange, the humiliation, and the alleged pact between Locascio and Gravano to kill Gotti. Prison officials reportedly captured Gotti on video cameras complaining about the passage. Without identifying Gotti by name, federal officials noted in court papers that a possible contract had been placed on Locaccio's life by his former Mafia associates. Law enforcement sources indicated that Gotti had reached out to the Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist prison gang, and that two members of the group were used in 1994 as part of a murder-for-hire arrangement. Locascio was placed in solitary confinement for his own protection, a condition he fought through a lawsuit insisting he was not in danger. The irony was not subtle. The organization that Locascio had served with such discipline had treated his loyalty as expendable. Gotti had demoted him for trying to save a man's life. Gotti had threatened his lawyer into providing a compromised defense. Gotti had, from prison, allegedly ordered his murder through a white supremacist gang. The boss whose name Locascio had praised at sentencing, the man for whom Locascio had declared his guilt consisted solely of friendship, had repaid that friendship with threats, betrayal, and an assassination contract. In November of 2018, nearly 27 years after the trial, Gravano signed a declaration that offered the closest thing to exoneration that the legal system would allow. The declaration stated that Frank Locascio had no role in the planning of, nor did he participate in any way in the murder or conspiracy to murder Louis de Bono. Gravano noted that he had never been asked at trial whether Locascio had agreed with the decision to kill de Bono, nor whether Locascio had approved of the hit. He pointed to the wiretapped conversation from December of 1989 in which Locascio had tried to calm Gotti and broker the peace deal. Locaccio's role as a member of the administration, Gravano wrote, did not require him to agree with the boss in every situation. In February of 2020, the Second Circuit granted Locascio permission to file a successive habeas petition based on Gravano's declaration as newly discovered evidence. Judge Glasser, the same judge who had presided over the original trial nearly 3 decades earlier, denied the motion. Locaccio's attorneys also sought compassionate release under the First Step Act, citing his advanced age and deteriorating health. The request was denied. On December 28, 2020, Locascio tested positive for COVID at FMC Devens. He recovered by January 8, 2021, but his health was failing. On September 28, 2021, he was placed in the Comfort Care program for multiple medical complications. His daughter Lisa told the New York Daily News what happened in his final days. He had called her on a Monday to say his goodbyes. He said the things you say to your daughter when you choose your daughter to be the last phone call you're going to make. She drove to Massachusetts and went to his bedside at the federal facility. She held her father in her arms and sang him Frank Sinatra as he took his final breaths. Frank Locascio died on October 1st, 2021 at FMC Devens. He was 89 years old. He had been in federal custody for 30 years, 9 months, and 20 days. He had never cooperated with the government. He had never testified against anyone. His daughter said he never complained during his 3 decades in prison and that he never snitched. That means something, she said. I will not explain it to you. The disparity between their outcomes was a measure of something larger than individual cases. It was a measure of what the federal criminal justice system valued most. Information was the currency that purchased freedom. The men who possessed it and traded it received the benefit. The men who possessed it and refused to trade it received nothing. Locascio possessed decades of knowledge about the internal workings of the Gambino family. He had sat in rooms where decisions were made. He had observed the distribution of wealth, the resolution of disputes, the imposition of discipline. He knew things that prosecutors would have valued enormously. He chose not to sell what he knew. The price of that choice was 31 years in a federal medical facility, aging into his 80s and then his late 80s, while the world outside continued without him. The story that is remembered from that courtroom in Brooklyn is the story of John Gotti, the Teflon Don, the Dapper Don, the man who beat the system 3 times and lost on the 4th. That story has its own shape and its own meaning. But beside the famous man sat a man whose story tells something the famous story does not. Locascio was convicted primarily on the strength of recordings in which his voice barely appears. His silence on the tapes was interpreted by the court as consent to murder. His one attempt to prevent that murder, the brokered peace deal for De Bono, had cost him his position in the organization. His defense at trial was, according to his own legal filings, compromised by death threats from his co-defendant directed at his own attorney. The man who broke the oath of silence served 5 years in federal prison. The man who kept the oath served 31 years and died in custody. The arithmetic of those outcomes is not a commentary on justice in the abstract. It is a specific accounting of what the federal system produced in the case of the Gambino crime family's leadership at the end of the 20th century. The government's interest was not in proportional punishment, but in the dismantling of the organization, and the cooperating witness who made that dismantling possible received the benefit that the system promised to men who broke the oath. Gravano served his 5 years, entered witness protection, and then destroyed his own freedom by running the largest ecstasy ring in Arizona, involving dozens of associates, many of them teenagers. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to additional decades. He was released in 2017. He gave interviews. He appeared on YouTube. He wrote about the life he had lived and the men he had betrayed with the casualness of a man who had concluded that the rules he had once sworn to uphold were fictions that other men still believed in. Locascio, by contrast, remained in the same facility, in the same cell, under the same sentence, refusing to participate in the system that would have freed him in exchange for his testimony. He had seen what cooperation produced. He had watched the man who cooperated receive 5 years for 19 murders. He chose the alternative. His son Salvatore, who had become a Gambino caporegime, was convicted in 2004 on federal charges connected to a cramming scheme that defrauded telephone customers of millions of dollars. Father and son were both in the federal system at the same time, their criminal careers overlapping in the institutional record the way they had overlapped in the organizational structure of the family they had both served. Gotti's son, John Jr. Gotti, attempted to take over the family's operations during the 1990s, but was himself convicted on racketeering charges. Peter Gotti, John's older brother, assumed nominal control and was convicted in 2004 of racketeering and conspiracy to murder Gravano. The organization that Carlo Gambino had built with patience and discretion, and that John Gotti had commanded with noise and spectacle, was, by the 2000s, a diminished version of what it had been, its leadership imprisoned or dead, its earning capacity reduced, its institutional memory fragmented by decades of prosecution and cooperation. The Gambino family that Gotti led did not survive his conviction in any form resembling its former power. The visibility that had defined his reign was the same visibility that allowed the government to identify every significant member of the organization, bug the rooms where they met, and build the case that destroyed them. and the men who had followed that philosophy most faithfully, who had appeared at the Ravenite 5 nights a week because the boss told them to, who had sat in bugged rooms because the boss chose those rooms, paid for his philosophy with their freedom. The Genovese family, which had operated with exactly the opposite philosophy under Vincent Gigante, choosing invisibility over fame, appointing a front boss to absorb prosecution while the real boss shuffled through Greenwich Village in a torn bathrobe, survived the same era that destroyed the Gambinos. The contrast between the two organizations was a case study in the consequences of visibility. Gigante's family remained, by the FBI's assessment after his death, the most powerful and most secretive of the five families. Gotti's family became a cautionary tale about what happens when a criminal organization allows its leader to become a celebrity. Every camera that photographed Gotti entering the Ravenite also photographed the men who entered behind him. Every newspaper that printed his name also printed the names of his associates. Every television report that made him famous also made his organization visible to the government agencies that were building the case that would end it. Locascio was one of the men captured in that visibility. He had not sought it, he had not created it, he had been summoned to the Ravenite by the boss, and the boss's insistence on public performance, on weekly appearances at a social club in the most watched neighborhood in New York, on discussions of criminal matters in rooms that any cautious man would have assumed were bugged, had produced the recordings that convicted everyone who sat in those rooms. The system that destroyed the Gambino family was, in the end, the system that Gotti himself had designed, a hierarchy built around one man's ego, sustained by the compulsory presence of the men who served him, and documented by the surveillance apparatus that his visibility had attracted. The Ravenite Social Club at 247 Mulberry Street was eventually forfeited to the federal government in October of 1997. Judge Glasser himself signed the order. The United States Marshal Service descended on the building that had served as headquarters for 3 generations of Gambino leadership. It became, in time, a shoe store. The apartment where the recordings were made became just another unit in just another building. The quiet man from the Bronx, who sat in those rooms and said almost nothing, died in a federal medical facility in Massachusetts, with his daughter singing to him, having never once cooperated with the people who had taken his life one day at a time for 31 years. He was 89 years old. He had been free for 58 of those years and imprisoned for 31. The arithmetic is the story.